Hello folks, this is Alan Watt, and today it is the 17th of January 2007. A couple of days ago there was about 4 inches of snow fell down in Toronto, along with some ice pellets and freezing weather. And this stretched all the way apparently down to Texas. And I do believe that in many of the states, the US states, in the path of the storm, they've declared a state of national emergency, which is something we have to get used to, because we're going to get more and more of this crisis management and creation, of course, as time goes on. Interestingly enough, I had calls from different citizens in the US telling me that the National Guard had been brought in, and who knows what other troops are brought in from where during this kind of thing. No one asked the questions. But also MPs, military police, have been brought into some of the larger towns and cities to go door to door and supposedly see if everybody's okay. Which is a dumb question in major cities. When their power goes out, they're stranded, aren't they? They're pretty well helpless, and that's the beauty, for a controller's point of view, of having people stuck like sardines in cities. The power outages we had 2 or 3 years ago throughout Canada down up into the States, which apparently this couldn't trace the cause of, how this chain reaction of power outages happened when they had all these fail-safes there. That was a test. That was a test to see if they could, how long it would take the public to get edgy, cry for help and so on. But that was done in the summer months, and at that time it was heat build up in the big apartments that was causing most of the problems and the illnesses. This time it's called an ice storm, brought lots of power lines down. And if you look, and I noticed this maybe 5-6 years ago, you see, the only time I look at the television is to tune in to see what the weather is supposed to be. And about 5 or 6 years ago, for the first time, I saw the Gulf Stream coming up the west coast, offshore, and doing a right angle at British Columbia and going straight across Canada from coast to coast, and the fellow who was giving the weather talking as though it was just an everyday occurrence. It was unheard of up until then. And when I saw it at that time, I thought, well, that's exactly what is written into the United Nations Charter on Weather Warfare, the Treaty on Weather Warfare from the 1970s. But they had the ability then, and it had obviously been tried and tested for it to be written into a treaty, apart from the causing of earthquakes, famines, and hurricanes and tornadoes, floods or droughts. They had it written in that it could also cause the major streams, like the jet stream, to be brought down to ground level and directed to a target. Well, we've been witnessing it for the last few years, and now it's a normal occurrence. Everything becomes normal because we are so adaptable as a species, especially when we are trained to listen to experts. And if we flash back even further and try and dig into our little bit of memory that some of us still have left, through all the masses of data we're crammed with, mostly irrelevant, on a daily basis. Towards the start of the mid-90s, when the Cold War just happened to be suddenly ended, when Russia, the Soviet Union, decided to roll up its borders and its system, and Mr. Gorbachev came over to the US after being introduced and taken on a tour by Margaret Thatcher, the strange combination. the black and the grey or the white of the chessboard. All manipulated, of course, because even Lenin said that the dictatorship wouldn't last for probably more than 70 years. It was meant to join because it was fed by the same hand that fed capitalism. But so supposedly the Cold War was over in the 90s, and suddenly little towns across Canada and the States and different places, maybe even Europe too, were so segregated and kept isolated they won't tell you what's happening even in the next county. Even though you think you're getting the best news, worldwide news there is, they can tell you about a little boat in India with 50 people on it sinking in a river, but they can't tell you what's happening in the next county. That's how micromanaged we are. Because all media comes through the same 2 or 3 hands, the big companies like routers. Good name, you route the news, eh? And as I say, these emergency preparedness responses were being carried out, even in small, tiny potato villages like Allison, Ontario. And I drove in this particular day. I drove south and went into Allison. And there's the fire guys there. I think there were some people from the military watching on. And the police were there, and they had hired locals to pretend they were all sick and injured and had bandages on them, and stretchers, and cars askew as though they'd been damaged or whatever. And in the paper the next day, it said that they'd practiced having cars with bombs in them, dummy bombs. One of them outside the Baxter's laboratory, which is one of the big companies that used to belong to, well, it was part of IG Farben, still in the inoculation business of making us healthy. And I thought, what's all this? The Cold War's over. Everything's supposed to be peaceful now. And from then on, that particular day onwards, we had more and more blurbs across the country given out by the media, and even little special documentaries, maybe 15-minute documentaries on this network that had been just created. You imagine bureaucrats take years to plan anything. They didn't have it during the Cold War, when supposedly we were going to get nuked any time, any day or any night. And it's all over and we're at peace. But suddenly we had to have all these organizations, these emergency prepared centers, these headquarters for natural disasters or man-made. And they were rehearsing. And they sent booklets around the different areas to each person who lived in them, a little response book on what to do and who to obey in times of national or even local emergency. Long before 9/11 happened, but after the Cold War. Getting us all trained to be managed is the point of it all. This training to be managed. And it was rather evident from the 1950s onwards that weather modification was going to be the big stick to convince the people of the world by telling them that they were causing the abnormalities which we're now witnessing. But they were writing about it back in the 1950s. Only they got it wrong then. They said it was going to be an ice age. And the same authors who wrote these books, these frontmen, on behalf of the bigwigs, then a few years later, when they realized it was easier to superheat the atmosphere and cause various other phenomena, they said it was going to be global warming. Then the drumbeat started steadily for global warming. That in itself was fantastic enough. But it could only work because people have no idea at all, and I have to say this, how ignorant they are of any facts regardless of what kind of education they believed they've had, or what qualifications they walked out with. When I went to what we called primary school, I can remember they gave us books, you see, that which were passed down through generations, because we had a public service type school in Britain. And these books might have been 20 years old. And one of them was to do with geography and the history of geography. And I can still remember it yet, page for page, going through the fact that the climate is always changing. We don't go around the sun in a perfect circle. Not only that, the path we took last year is different from the one you take next year. And there have been many ice ages in previous time. Even at that time, the scientific groups had drilled into the Arctic and Antarctic and come across layers upon layers of previous ice ages. And they could tell when it had been warming, when it had been cooling, warming and cooling, and there was pollen, different stuff mixed in with it, different layers. What we're going through is a natural phenomena which at one time was taught to the people when you had a bit better education. And when you realize there's been, who knows, maybe thousands of ice ages in the past. Now what happens after an ice age? It's called an ice age because you're in the ice age. Well, what happens then is you warm and you're no longer in the ice age. But you don't stop warming, you warm up to a particular level. And then you do have various things happening. Now some of them are mini ice ages and mini warming ages. You don't have to go from one extreme to the other. In a natural system, that would be very rare unless you gave it a little boost with science, which is easy. It's kindergarten stuff today. But yes, after an ice age, you warm. And that's why we've not been living in an ice age for the last few thousand years. We had a mini warming age in the Middle Ages, when for a couple of hundred years they didn't build fires in their homes even to cook. It was just too warm. And that's in Europe. And they went back to snow in the winter and so on. So the history, the records of what was at one time observed and recorded study have simply been tucked away and removed from the upgraded books. That's why school books are always upgraded all the time by maybe 2-3 companies at the most that run the world. They can keep tabs on what you're being told, and that way they can withdraw knowledge easily. And it doesn't dawn from one intake to the next that they're getting taught less than the ones before. This is an amazing trick. Simply withhold knowledge, use a bit of science, have your front groups ready, well-funded front groups, and then they go into action and start hollering and screaming and getting very panicked. Do something, and you'll find that the drum rolls are starting to beat already, as I said they would. All through this winter, we're going to start to get more and more news on it until it's a daily thing, a daily event, till they bring up the global warming into the crowns of our minds. It will be there permanently fixed as they lead us on this merry dance to the solution, which will just be unfurled at the next global meeting. And the global meeting will go through the routines of pretending they're deciding things, because this has all been decided long ago, and the resolutions will be unfurled, and we'll all breathe a sigh of relief and say, my goodness, thank God for these experts who are going to save us all. that we've got to change our entire way of living. We can't go on like this. Nope. We've got to get herded into little habitat areas, like they had in the movie Soylent Green, where they can monitor us and watch us, and maybe even reduce us much easier if we're all crammed together, especially when you have to be totally interdependent in a city when they turn off the juice, whether the juice be food, water, heat, gas, electricity, whatever. They can turn it all off in a city and you're completely helpless. The new habitat areas. This was reinforced a few years ago when the United Nations, UN, passed a resolution for the creation of super cities. And then they started amalgamating all the different suburb cities, all the old cities, the smaller ones, and took the authority from them and put them into the central commands. You know, centralize and conquer. Remember the old communist routine, which is just the same as the capitalist routine, since it's the two sides of the same coin. We're watching it all being used today, and you wait and see. I can remember telling a relative back when they were bombing the hell out of Yugoslavia, and getting them into the World Bank afterwards. They weren't in the World Bank either, and they were also selling oil for $10 to $15 a barrel, and that was a big no-no. But when they were bombing it, I said to this relative, I said, you know, haven't you noticed that every day on the news now they're mentioning the United Nations to do with this? And he sort of vaguely said, yeah, because he used to sit and get hypnotized like most people do, and his jaw would drop open, and he'd just gaze at it. And I'd say, well, in a few months, you would be so used to hearing it, you'd think you've always heard the United Nations mentioned on the daily news. It'll be a fixture in your mind as though it's a natural thing that's now dictating to you and telling you how life must be. And that's the same technique we're seeing happening now, when just amazingly even local stations and television and radio are having Earthwatch experts come up to keep us informed of all this crisis. Now they already have the general public terrified of nature outside their doors, and the terrifying technique was obvious to me, at least, when they created 24-hour weather stations for television. I mean, who needs to hear the weather 24 hours per day? It was obvious that the intent was not to, unless you've got some strange illness where you've got a complete phobia of rain or something. Why would you need that? Well, it was to change natural weather and rain and wind and so on, the natural things we all experience if we, fly back through our memories, into crisis. And sure enough, in no time at all, maybe about 6 months, once they were up and running, a couple of millimeters of rain was going to be a crisis. And my goodness, now that they've changed snow from inches to centimeters, and sometimes they'll even use millimeters to really terrify you. You're going to get 4 centimeters, maybe even 10 centimeters of snow. Well, hey, this is Canada. Now they have people terrified when they hear this spoken. Something that you'd think nothing of, your parents would, and the grandparents would think nothing at all of, is going to be a major crisis. Crisis creation. And we always have the natural days in winter where you have freezing rain, and anybody with a little bit of grey matter stays home. You don't want to go running along those roads with little bits of rubber spinning away on ice. You would tell your children not to try and run on it. Why would you try and spin some rubber on it? It makes no sense at all. But then again, this commercial system wasn't meant to be logical when it came to obeying your instincts. You're supposed to be at work by 8 o'clock anyway, regardless. And we can see the effects of that in all the major highways when you do get snow and freezing rain. You're supposed to be there at the same time, ready to go, regardless of the fact if you've gone through 4 inches of rain or 10 inches of snow, and did get there without smashing another vehicle. What amazes me is there's not more vehicles smashing up when you realize how many cars are on the road. That's the miracle. But everything today now is crisis. And thank goodness we have experts to guide us. What would we do without them? A few days before this latest storm came in, I saw for the first time a new type of aerial spraying. And I've watched the spraying for years and seen the different types they have. They've got the polymer type that gets blue and hazy, bluish white and hazy. Then the white ones with the herringbone effect. And this new one was black, literally black, like black sooty clouds, and they spread very quickly. Going across the sky, you see the plane and the spray. And when the sun was trying to shine through it, they stood out even more so, like black sooty clouds. So I knew something was coming, and then turning on the shortwave, sure enough, there's the woof, 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 woof of the HAARP going. So the storm was coming. So if you want to know when there's a storm coming, get a shortwave radio and scan it, and you'll eventually be able to tell if it's going to be safe to go out the door. A couple of years ago, the American Air Force published in the newspapers the fact that it would shortly own the weather. Well, they do. They do own the weather, and have been manipulating it for years. Many, many years ago, John Dewey, who was sent to reorganize the school system and dumb everybody down to a suitable, educable level that's called equality. Apart from many of the other suggestions he made regarding removing information from history so there'd be no conflict with future generations to do with the past and their histories. He also mentioned, he was the first one to mention something that's been taken up like a banner with many other people since, like President Reagan. But John Dewey was the first one to mention if we had a threat from outer space, from out there, the world would have to unite against a common threat. And much has been written on this topic because they created the whole UFO phenomena. H.G. Wells did his invasion stuff a long time ago, part of the same clique. But you see, it's easier to use that. Just take a little bit, look at it slightly differently than you've been thinking about it, and you will see that we're looking at a threat from out there. That's what it appears to be with the weather, you see. And big bucks have gone into this, of yours, mind you, it's all tax money, to create the systems like HAARP. Now, they didn't build these massive monstrosities of technology just to take pictures of it and admire. They built them to use. And since they've signed treaties not to use them on each other, that's nations, that leaves them free range for only one other thing, that's to use them internally. And you'll find that most countries have these stations. The first time the world was allowed to know that they were up and running was when we had the woodpecker effect. The woodpecker effect was picked up by shortwave radio ham enthusiasts years ago in the early 70s, and that was the sound it made over the radio. It blasted every other station off the radio, and that was coming from Riga, which is in Latvia. It was a Soviet state at the time. And the Russians admitted it, and it was in the newspapers here that this was so. They were using this technology, this HAARP type technology. The next thing we're told, as well as one big one in Alaska, well, they have them all over the world. And this is going to be the threat from out there to get us all to change our entire ways of living and allow the experts to manage us. Now, that means in every single area of management. It's not just go here, do this, and be safe. You're well into an agenda. The first tested out on smaller scales and a lesser scale within the Soviet Union. But you're well into this agenda where they're going to use all that they knew, all they learned on the whole world is happening now through front groups, many of them appearing to be charitable, but they're also getting more and more power as charitable NGOs, all with United Nations affiliations, coming down to what you even say. And it's so clever, this technique, it can never fail. It's so clever. They start off with a premise which everyone will agree with. This was the thing to do with the rights of the child from the United Nations. Everyone thought, well, that's true, children should have rights. And sure, there are abused children, absolutely. Actually, the whole world's been abused, they just don't know by whom. In fact, they run towards their abuser, thinking it's their savior. That's how clever this system is. Show me a functional family, and then I'll ask you a question. How come? In this system. So they come out with the same techniques, rights to the child, and then the parents find out once it's all signed and put into law that the parents don't have any rights over the child at all. Who'd have thought of that one, eh? Huh? That's how it always works. Hate speech comes out with very good reasons initially why they want to bring laws in. But you know it's not going to end there, and that's not the intent either, and it's not to stop anyone criticizing any other group. That's nothing to do with it. That's only an outside form. Eventually you won't be able to criticize anything, including the government. In fact, it'll be a crime. It'll be called anti-government, right from the Soviet Union, if you even question any policy. And you'll be classified as being mentally ill for doing so. And they had a whole bunch of psychiatric definitions in the Soviet Union for those who questioned the system. That's now being introduced here. But first it was brought in under hate. You hate the government. Technically, that would mean that the opposition parties in every so-called democracy are haters. If they criticize their opposition, how come they don't lock them up? Huh? But no, it only applies to the people, you see. This is a very, very nefarious, deep, clever system you're living in. What's been presented on the media is the lowest level of understanding, and most of that is fake. They give you the topics to argue about, to worry about, to think about. They call it raising social consciousness. That's the term they use when they want you to get you to change your ways of thinking and doing. Motivational behavior alteration, conditioned responses, Pavlovian techniques, until Joe Public babbles all the terms that he hears coming from the media. He babbles them like a tape recorder, without thinking, because he's never given anything really any conscious thought. They just start babbling them. They repeat their downloads to each other. If we look at these big charitable organizations and their Masonic logos, of course, you'll see why Albert Pike talked about the outer portico of lower Freemasonry. The outer portico are the guys who are a bit higher than the lodges they initially joined. They wear little funny hats and they drive around in little dinky toy cars at parades and things and do the occasional charity. It's hard to go beyond that when you're investigating, isn't it? To investigate a charitable organization. Oh, you must be nasty. And that's the greatest protection they have for the real plan behind it, for those higher up who don't wear funny little hats. And ask those men with funny little hats how many freebies they've taken that you don't get access to, how many speeding tickets they get away with, how many fast, immediate bank loans they get by being good little Masons. Why don't they extend that charity to everybody else? Well, you see, everybody else is the profane. Hard to attack charitable organizations, at least with the fronts of them. And yet this idea of charity and the front of charitable organizations is very, very old, this technique. The old man in the mountain that came up with the whole idea of the Ishmaelis, the assassins, recruited thousands of orphans. He would take them in and bring up these mountain home, and they'd be fed and all the rest of it, and they would initially have charities. And everybody thought how wonderful this fellow is. And he taught these young guys as they grew up, and they used hashish rather liberally. I don't think the CIA was around then to give it to them, but maybe, who knows. And the young guys would grow up into men thinking this was the nearest thing to heaven, and they were told that it was the nearest thing to heaven. And they were given things and the lifestyle that the ordinary person was forbidden to live, and they were given women too. Growing up, that is. And then they were well educated, sent off to be advisors to different heads of state. And they could be sleepers for years. Then when they were told to kill whomever, they simply drew out their dagger and did it. Instant obedience. Because they were taught if they were killed themselves, they'd go straight to heaven. And heaven to them was something that they thought they'd grown up in, or the nearest thing to it. All under the guise initially of a charity. Hard to attack charities. And yet the secret societies have been hiding behind the veils of them for thousands of years. Those who have suddenly looked around them, still standing on the floor of the bottom level of the matrix, generally freak out at the information that hits them because it's available from some good sources and an awful lot of bad sources. And they panic. And the bad sources, they're run by the big boys, because this isn't the first time this technique has been used. We'll have them spinning off in helter-skelters of the most amazing disinformation ever designed, because they know that the average person who's, as I say, just woken up to one part of it, that is that his life is changing drastically, rather quickly. We don't notice when it's done slowly, you see, but they're on a roll now. They know that the person is freaking out. And the first conclusion they're encouraged to think of is that this is too diabolical and too overwhelming to be done by humans. This is encouraged through lots of the authorized authors who put out there to promote all kinds of things, from the space aliens to slimy things that walk around looking like people and not yet people either. And that seems palatable to the average person who's just, as I say, in the freaking out stage of how did all this happen. They've been living in a fairyland, a dream, up until that point, with their favourite newscasters looking very mature and very fatherly and staring at them in the eye every 6 o'clock newscast. And would he lie to you? Of course not. I mean, to think that the whole world is lying to you would put you into a category which would make it easy for them to lock you up. So don't freak out. Accept it calmly and quietly. Yep, you've been conned big time. And not just you, billions of other people too, across the planet, have been conned, because this scientific process has been in operation for an awful long time. Awful long time. And they put out the fake disinfo guys, counterintelligence, who gathers all the intelligence, the facts that are being passed around, mix it with the absurd, and discredit the facts. I get it all the time from people who, as I say, they're on roller coasters with all this disinformation, mixed up with real information. And that's what they always say, well, humans could never have dreamt this up, it's just too big. And that's because they're still thinking that it's just happened, suddenly. It's also an egotistical problem because they can't imagine how they could have been fooled so perfectly. But you've been trained that way since your birth, and your parents didn't know. And like all mammals, you accept that if the parents don't show danger signals towards a certain area, you'll think everything's quite natural within that area. That's how simple this is. And you'll see networks of people, generally very old men, who do get life extension, there's no doubt whatsoever. They get a superior health care the public will never be let into, and your science magazines will still keep you living in the cave age, stone man age, the era, with their latest this and latest that. Everything they tell us is obsolete and very old. You have a network of old guys, an old boys club, to introduce people who work their way up the pyramid through many different rituals and proving their worth. You must be worthy, as they say. It means you must keep your mouth shut. And you do the dirty deeds on the public and keep your mouth shut too. And you take the rewards and keep your mouth shut. And the higher they go, the worse they become, until they're really conning in a big way, and you can still keep their mouth shut. That's the system. And they're pulled out of CEO offices, or banks, or corporations, many of which are just owned by the secret services like the CIA anyway, and moved all over the planet, into the United Nations, out of the United Nations, into politics, back into a CEO's job, back into the United Nations, in perpetual circles. And they always know their part in the agenda. They're very worthy, they're trustworthy, you see. You can keep their mouths shut. Recently I was looking at an old documentary with Saddam Hussein greeting a young Donald Rumsfeld back in 1974. And here's this geezer still on the go today, in the same occupation, lifers, absolute lifers, to do with the military side of government. And they're still as active as ever. I mean, where's his senility? Where's his old age disease, etc.? Why is he still so fervent that he just can't put his feet up with all his millions and just retire and go fishing? Well, they don't, if you notice. They can't stop, because it's a religion. That's where you see that kind of fervor. It's within a religion. That's the only place you'll see it. They are fanatical. In the late 80s, Maurice was pulled out of the United Nations. Now, this man was picked up as a young guy by Rockefeller and groomed to be a front man, which he has been very loyal to, in fact, all these years. And wherever he's gone, he's made major changes in the world system. Little Mark Strong. He's a strong man, you might say. And he was pulled out of the United Nations to come to all places, to Ontario, Canada, by Bob Rae, the Premier at that time of Ontario. Who's got a fascinating story that was printed in the Toronto Sun. And he pulled Maurice Strong and gave him a job as the head of Ontario Hydro. And I said, big things are going to happen here, because you don't pull this kind of character, the big gun, to swat a mosquito. So something big was going to happen. And he no sooner got to Ontario than he starts organizing and reorganization to privatize the whole Ontario power system, all the grids, all the companies and so on, from public ownership to private ownership. That was what he was brought in to do. Multi-billion-dollar task. Then it was found out he was still working for the United Nations. So he kept the job under the tenure of $1 a day from Ontario Hydro just to keep the job till he was finished. But at the time in the newspapers, it was announced that Strong was putting into motion a plan where public money would finance huge generator systems, diesel, etc., to run all government agencies and all major necessary infrastructure, including factories. Not that there's many left here. And I thought, what's going on here? The Cold War's over. The oil was pumping away, not too badly at that time. And there seemed to be no crisis, so it told you there was going to be a crisis created in the future. And once he'd done all the setting up to privatize it, and these deals of who they're going to sell it to are arranged behind closed doors years before the public even know it's begun. Everything is prearranged. And sure enough, once he'd done his job, he back to the United Nations, to the World Bank at that time. Then they sent him to Peking, or not Peking, it was China. They sent him to Beijing. It changed from a P to a B. Anyway, and then of course he had the job to really get the ball going for Chinese commerce for the rest of the world, and working at a UN building in China. These players are pulled out the hat, always. Same guys over and over. From the time of the Vietnam War to every war since, they're on the move all over the planet. And they all know each other very, very well, because they all obey the same boss. And here they are, bringing us into the global system. It's already here, we know that, where you're going to have a completely monitored society who can't open their mouth in case they're going to be fined, charged, or thrown in jail for uttering something which is incorrect. That's the system we're going into. Follow the trail of eugenics and the history of eugenics if you want to see how many of these guys got their start, because you'll find they all belonged to these societies. Eugenics was brought up to cull off the useless eaters, which would not be required in a scientifically orientated society. And they're going at it really strong now, and passing all kinds of laws They have this, the whole of the cultures in the Western world debased enough that we don't care what happens in medicine, or the fact there's a whole industry selling body parts, this Frankensteinian monster. We are debased. The same elite who are guiding us will mock so-called primitive societies that go through all kinds of mourning ceremonies for the dead. And they'll mock them. And yet you see, your respect for the dead gives you respect for the living. Will be knocked down one stone at a time until there's no foundation left. Maurice Strong's benefactor, the Rockefeller family, were the ones in the US who backed the whole eugenics program going way back to the 1920s. Eugenics means good stock, and the term was first used by Charles Galton, Darwin's descendant. It was all based on their pseudoscience of evolution, which ran in the family lineage of the Darwin family, since Charles Darwin's father and grandfather both wrote books on the same thing that he eventually wrote on. Didn't take off too well until they really publicized it and put it under Charles's name. And this whole idea that races and inferior types die off, and they must do, is part of the inner high Masonic tradition. It's basic Hinduism, actually. And many thousands of people were sterilized forcibly across the Western world, and they had branches in every country. And they were teaching that the inferior types must be killed off. The US, in its own eugenics society, used to put out magazines every month and have photographs of the best families with their frontal views of their skulls and side views and all this kind of stuff to show you how superior they were. This is how silly people are when you give them a bit of flattery and you pump up their ego. But not just silly, they become very dangerous when they start to believe it and believe they have the right to dictate to the lessers. Herbert Spencer brought out the idea of evolutionary psychology, and this was all tied up with this theory of evolutionary types and superior types and inferior types. You think that Adolf Hitler was the only guy who came up with that? No. There's men behind Hitler who were on the go before he was born in the German branch of this, under the guise of science again, the white-coated scientist, the new priesthood. That's all they are, with all their theories. And they've been very successful in convincing the world that they know what they're talking about in so many areas, and we believe them. We've been taught, just like we were taught in the past ages to believe the guys with the black dresses on, to believe these new ones, and we believe them just as well, because they're experts. And gee, what are we? Racial hygiene is nothing new at all, and it wasn't based simply in Germany. The funding came from the big foundations, like the Rockefeller Foundation. People forget that Adolf Hitler was Time Life Man of the Year twice in the 1930s, when he was going through all this stuff, killing off all the mentally disabled and the unfit. It wasn't until he crossed the borders he became the bad guy. People forget all about that. They forget the tours of the aristocracy from all other countries of Europe, including England, went over to have tours of the New Germany and how they were this great experiment. We'll find this in the history books. It means more than you think. We had the United States experiment and the Soviet experiment and the Nazi experiment, all funded by the same big power brokers and foundations, as they studied us all and did with us as they wished, and got us to cheer them on in different countries. That's why the mass man must always be feared. Individualism is the only thing, the only enemy they have today. The thinker, who can explain this and put it across to others so they in turn might think. Monsters and psychopaths are recruited and given their own special education, which enables them to do what they do and feel good about it. And they never retire. They're globe-trotting all over the place, from one position to the other in this massive network, and they all know each other, and they don't have to ask aliens what the next step is. They don't need LSD or any Peruvian drug to make them turn into reptiles and do a little dance or any of that. They are, though, very inbred. And like Plato said, you can create humans by interbreeding, just like animals, for specific traits. You go back into the Darwinian family, you'll find that was happening with Charles and right back to his grandfather and before, where they only inbred with one other family called the Wedgwood family of Wedgwood pottery, all belonging to this higher Masonic Eugenics society. You breed your way into high Masonry by accepting the spouse that's been trained and also reared, and marrying them and doing what you're told. Then that offspring gets to a higher level. It is a breeding program, and the little guys at the bottom don't know that, and most of them never will. They don't know much at all, in fact. People will never conquer this on a large level until they demand to know who these characters are, who are on the seats and the chairs of their local council, their police forces, their school councils, their local government levels, who fill the bureaucracies and the head positions from local to federal. They'll never get further until they demand the answers, because you'll be completely, utterly shocked. You must be in one of these Freemasonic organizations in this system in the West to get ahead, as they say. The Wizard of Oz is very active. The little man behind the curtains with all the technology and the levers and the buttons. It can terrify you in 1,000 ways. And that's what was really written in to that movie. And the yellow brick road, all higher Masonic terms. Oz is found in the Bible, sometimes under OZ, sometimes under OS, sometimes under US, and sometimes under UZ. Depends on the version. We live in a very complex system, and yet its complexity can be the Achilles heel for someone who can break through the very basic bottom level, not get trapped with the people who are deliberately put out there to suck you in and ride you in circles till you're even more confused than ever. And they'll use all the material put out by the small guys who never had the financing to get the big booksellers on their side. Someone called me just the other day and mentioned a particular one, and he says, do you know, you put in there that about the troglodytes and trog, and trog backwards is gort, and gort is the robot in the day the earth stood still. And you see, I talked about all that stuff back in the 90s, and it's all taped, and I've given it lots of them. And these characters or their teams just gather it up, put it in their books, spin it into whatever, and they get the publicity and unfortunately mislead people. And what I didn't mention to this fella also is that there was a group called the Trogs. See what song they sung, add that to your next book. You're living it under control. Fascination will be the end of you if you allow yourself to be fascinated by tremendous tales. Just as religion has been used for thousands of years and very effectively. In the Middle Ages they had people terrified at one time of even living in the forest they'd been born in, because there was demons everywhere, and shadows suddenly became demons, and oh my goodness, everything became demonic. And the only safe place was the church, and that's where you brought your valuables and gave it to them, and got blessed and protected by little stories and little spells they would put out there for you of protection. Well, I'm running out of time right now. Keep warm, keep safe, stock up on basic stuff that you need to live in case they give you an emergency. Just the basic stuff. Keep warm, that's important. And have some food, and some jugs for water, and some candles, and you'll be fine. All the best from me tonight, and Hamish the dog, and may your God go with you.